And you're live.
Fantastic. Hey, good morning, everyone. It's the one, the Oli V, the Gorilla, coming to you live on another special edition of the Sirius Report with none other than an individual who needs no introductions whatsoever, London Paul. You can check out his website at theseriusreport.com, theseriusreport.com. And also, guys, check out our website, roguemoney.net, and also check out our sponsor. If you're having any sort of debt issues, collectors calling you, you're getting harassed or whatnot, you need to have the reset button hit on your credit score, check out myfreedomnow.us. That is myfreedomnow.us. The links will be set below. With that being said, without any further ado, Paul, how are you?
I'm very well, and yourself?
I'm doing great, man. It seems as if so many things are happening. I think the frequency of attacks by the deep state, they've gone full level 11, Paul. That's what it seems like.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's getting very hard now to decipher stories when the mainstream media says one thing, then someone in the alternative media says something else. And I think the latest business with obviously Michael Flynn and the Russian ambassador and what did he say and what didn't he say is a classic example. I mean, obviously there's been these allegations that Michael Flynn engaged in conversations with Russian diplomats about US sanctions before Trump's inauguration. Now, by all accounts, Trump said he's not aware of the reports that have suggested this. And then a US official apparently confirmed to CNN that Flynn and this Russian ambassador did speak about sanctions, amongst other things, during the call. Now, weirdly, apparently the context of this conversation wasn't clear to the FBI and intelligence agencies that reviewed the content. And they said there's nothing to indicate that he made any promises or acted improperly in the discussion. Then Flynn apparently said he couldn't rule out that he hadn't spoken about something to do with the sanctions. And then, of course, what the mainstream media was saying that Flynn urged Russia not to overreact to penalties imposed by Barack Obama and made it clear the two sides would be in a position to review the matter after Trump was elected. And then, of course, the Kremlin's weighed in and said, denied the information, and when asked whether the Russian ambassador discussed sanctions, they said there were certain conversations, but it's better to double check with the information in the foreign ministry, and other than that the information's not correct. And this is what it's getting like. We're getting stories, counter stories, and it's very hard to make sense of anything. And that's one small example involving, the National Security Advisor. You're absolutely right when you extrapolate that across the whole entire media. And unfortunately, the alternative media is having its problems too. I mean, I've read stories that, apparently Trump's already resigned. even though he keeps signing executive orders. And I mean, here's the question: if you think he's resigned, why did he go to the bother of going to get elected, and then after 2 weeks go, oh, I'm just going to resign, and that's it? I mean, but this is the problem, and of course, people are latching onto all these different stories, and of course, it makes our job quite that much more interesting to decipher the reality of what's going on. But these are kind of classic examples of the problems we have, not just with the mainstream media and the so-called fake news, but we're also getting fake news in the alternative media, or what's something that may pertain to being fake news. We don't even know that. And this is the problem we're having now more than ever.
Yeah, absolutely correct, Paul. Absolutely correct. It's the level of fake news is gone to such obscene levels. And what these people fail to realize time and time again is for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. These guys are really doubling down, which I've said since 2016 could be the worst thing that they could possibly do, Paul. And this is seriously going to backfire on them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And we're already seeing, I mean, well, we saw how it's backfired on them to do with Brexit. It backfired on them to do with Trump's, election and subsequent inauguration. We're now starting to see panic spreading in France and Europe about Le Pen. I mean, a week ago, Le Pen's never going to get elected. She won't even make the second stage. Never mind. Oh, hang on, she's going to make the second stage. No, she'll never get elected. Now it's, oh, she might get elected. And now, of course, it's, well, if France leaves the European Union, it's going to cost them 30, 40, 100, who knows, billion euros. And if France leaves, of course, it's the end of the European Union, and panic stations are set in. But what they don't realize is the very things they're calling out and saying this is an extremist view. because of their attitude and how they're conducting themselves. They're driving more and more people to support the views. Now, I'm not saying anyone's more extremist than anyone else, but they take the view that this person's extremist, and they give, essentially what they're doing is allowing the likes of Le Pen and the Brexit vote to succeed because of their attitude. And they still haven't grasped that obvious fact that that's exactly what they're contributing to their own demise by doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely correct, without a doubt. What's the latest that's going on in the Eurozone? And we can take it whichever way you want. Feel free to lead us in whatever direction you want to go into, Paul.
Okay, well, we spoke about, obviously, to do with France and what's going on there now. Italy, it turns out Italy's financial woes are probably even worse than we anticipated. I mean, we know it's facing a banking crisis, an economic crisis, and a debt crisis, and a political crisis all at the same time. I mean, just how much worse can it get for them? But by all accounts, the country's got two bad banks, the Atlante 1 and Atlante 2. Now, they were created to stabilize the financial system. Apparently, they themselves are now on the verge of collapse.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and there's no clear vision, apparently, to do with how the problem's supposed to be addressed. There's some bad banker in chief who's been complaining that the bank system itself is responsible for this, and he's leveraged the blame at two of Italy's largest financial institutions, and basically said, they started to invest in these banks, support them, and now they're no longer investing in it. Now, I think it's less to do with the fact they've got cold feet. I think it's more to do with the fact these own banks' own shortcoming is becoming a major problem as well.
Yeah.
And then, of course, not only does it involve Italian banks, but he's also suggesting the blame for the bad banks' chronic underfunding rests with Crédit Agricole and BNP Paribas, which is obviously two French banks most exposed to Italian sovereign and banking debt,
sure,
which apparently aren't doing their part in cleaning up the Italian financial system. Well, no surprise why they're backing away from it. So, Italy keeps rumbling on. The Greek situation will just rumble and rumble and rumble, and will they eventually call a bluff, or will they just kick the can down the road? Well, we'll see what happens in that regard. I don't think really it matters a whole lot. I think, from what I understand, the Germans really do want Greece out the European Union now. Obviously, they don't want Italy because it's the third biggest economy. They certainly don't want France to leave, because that would be the end of it. But we're also seeing incredibly now that the European Union hierarchy themselves, who've been a real diktat for forever in terms of all the rules and regulations, they're now backing off, going, well, it's about time these nations took responsibility for what's going on instead of passing the buck to us, which is incredibly hypocritical, but also a sign of their desperation, that they're so fearful now that if the thing all blows up, nations will turn around and go, well, it was the ECB, it was the European Commission, it wasn't us as nations. And of course, the hierarchy in the European Union is now so frightened, they're going, well, we want to pass the buck because we don't want to be seen to be the people who brought the European Union down. So there's that going on. Of course, Germany, interestingly, Steinmeier's just been elected. Now he's going to be far more pro-Russia than anyone else. And of course, the Russians immediately have jumped on this one to apparently have a meeting with him. Mm-hmm. At some point, the realization that Germany wants out of the European Union, as the lawmakers do and commerce do, is going to become apparent. And this may take us a step further in that direction in a more overt way. It's been covertly going on, as we've said before, for some considerable period of time, where the Russians and the Germans have been talking about such moves. And of course, the whole thing with Soros just keeps rolling on. The Macedonians are now complaining that he's been meddling in their country politically. Well, no surprise there. But nations are getting more and more vocal about what Soros is up to, or not up to, as the case may be. So yeah, it's becoming more and more of a melting pot. And of course, there's this whole thing now with Brexit, and the European Union Commission or commissioners just don't know how to handle that. I'm not sure the British know how to handle it. I don't think anyone in the UK is capable of knowing exactly what they need to do in order to get out of the European Union. They now know, of course, they've got the mandate to invoke Article 50. But they really just do not have a clue what it is they want to do precisely. I mean, they've come out with this, we talked about it last week, these bullet point plan of what they want to do. And yes, it all sounds grand, but where's the detail? And that is a huge problem. And of course, there's all this rumours again of banks are going to leave. The the UK will leave the City of London if Britain obviously does end up leaving the European Union. Of course, meanwhile, what none of them are really talking about is the reality is the European Union's collapsing and imploding anyway. And probably within 2 years, I'll be surprised if the European Union exists as it does now. And we're certainly starting to see more and more evidence of what I understand will end up happening is that the European Union will certainly break up, but we might start to see groups of nations, rather like pre-World War kind of one time, where you'll have groups of nations like the old Austro-Hungarian Empire that will all kind of form little unions and work together, and not to the detriment of other unions, but I think that's very much likely to start happening. So will you see it with Austria and Hungary? Quite likely. Other nations may join it. Of course, it's not saying the map of Europe is going to be completely redrawn World War One, so we end up going back to the days when Germany was Prussia, etc., etc. But certainly there's a lot of reason to believe that's going to happen. So yeah, Europe's this kind of gigantic melting pot that just keeps rumbling on. And of course, you've got the French elections, you've got the Dutch elections, you've got the elections coming up later on in the year in Germany, and I think people are already brandishing Schultz as the next Trump, which he may take as a compliment, but probably not. So yeah, that's kind of, I guess, the gist of what's going on there, and of course there's also, I think Austria are very keen to start renegotiating to the whole CETA agreement between the European Union and Canada. They're talking about the TPP as well, even though I'm not sure why they're talking necessarily, but they're just talking about trade agreements and how rather fed up they are with everything that's going on. So, but Austria privately has said a lot of things in the last couple of years where they're leaning towards more military cooperation with Russia, which set alarm bells off. And they basically said we won't have NATO dictating to us how we look after our domestic security arrangements. So
yeah,
another nation. So yeah, I think it's just, the reality is everybody knows the European Union's finished, except probably Draghi, who thinks it will be still going on in 1,000 years' time.
The 1,000-year Reich.
when he'll still be probably wheeled out saying we'll do whatever it takes to keep it going, and someone will have to point out to him that it dissolved 990 years ago or whatever it is. But jokes aside, yeah, that's the kind of reality. But one thing I did pick up on, not related to this, was the oil sector, and there's a huge amount. I went through and looked at a load of stuff and found some pretty damning evidence to do with where the US's top 3 oil companies, which is obviously ExxonMobil, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips. Now, their economic situation has become so bad they're now forced to borrow money to pay dividends or capital expenditure, capex requirements. Now, according to the most recent financial reports, those top 3 companies' combined net income has dropped from in 2012, which was $80 billion
Wow.
to $3.7 billion.
Wow.
Now, and it gets even worse.
Wow.
The net income does not include obviously capital expenditures or dividend payouts.
Right.
Now, if we look at the oil companies' free cash flow, they've actually been losing money for the past 2 years. It was about nearly 9 billion in 2015 and just over 7 billion in 2016. Now, what's also interesting is the total capex spending of these companies has dropped from about 87 billion in 2013 to 46 billion. So they're dropping their capex and still not being able to balance their books. And if you subtract the dividends, the situation's even worse, because they've made losses in 2013 of about 14 billion. And that rose to 33 billion nearly in 2015 and 29 billion in 2016. So, more or less, in keeping for the last 2 years. Their long-term debt obligation has gone from 40 billion in 2012 to nearly 96 billion in 2016.
They are running red.
Yeah. Now, it gets, of course, even more interesting because the Energy Information Administration reported last week that the 4-week average of gasoline supplied or implied gasoline demand was 8.2 million barrels per day, which is the lowest for 5 years. So what we're seeing is the disintegration of the top 3 oil companies, and they're supposed to be a benchmark of the prosperity in this sector. So what does that tell us about shale oil and gas industries?
It's worthless.
Yeah, and then then we look at what's being done to prop all this up. Now, there's a question here. The hedge funds have amassed the biggest ever bet on rising oil prices. Obviously, as investors back this OPEC bid to tighten the crude oil market and keep the prices higher. Sorry. Now, these speculators have built long positions equivalent to almost 1 billion barrels of crude oil across major contract. Now, but what overall the actual long position, because obviously the shorts as well, is about 100 million barrels. It's supposed to be nearly 900 million barrels. That paper position is equivalent to over 9 days of global oil demand. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. Now, the question is, are they responsible for the hike in oil prices? Possibly. And what happens if en masse they sell their trades to take profits? Well, then obviously the price is going to drop considerably. And of course, the flip side is what happens if there's another macroeconomic or geopolitical event which could smash the price. On these hedge funds holding these enormous long positions, well, it's going to be good night Vienna for some of these hedge fund companies.
Oh my God! Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And then of course we've got Wall Street involved as well. I mean, crude inventories are close to 80-year record highs.
Sure, it's such a glut.
And Wall Street keeps on piling money into oil and gas companies because obviously the banking cabal need to do everything they can to prop up the petrodollar. And apparently in January alone, there was nearly $7 billion invested in 13 different equity offerings. I mean, these are for drilling, I mean, it's staggering how much they're doing everything to prop it up.
You know what
the reality is exactly the opposite.
I mean, also what people don't realize, Paul, is that oil is one of the most financialized commodities on the planet. People don't realize that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, actually, I'm going to, without plugging the new YouTube channel, I'm going to do a little podcast about the petrodollar to give some background and history so people understand why it is that huge. And of course, the interesting fact is, and we talked about Iran last week, now Iran's oil and how it's dangerous for the US to start, meddling too much in Iran. But if you look, Iran, while all the other OPEC nations are dropping the oil output, it rose 3% month on month in January. And its total exports for January rose to nearly 2.2 million barrels of oil per day. Now, obviously, Iran's the only Middle Eastern producer to see export rise because all the others are in this OPEC-led agreement. But interestingly, and what's not being said an awful lot is, unlike its peers under this OPEC-led agreement, Iran has enough room to boost its production daily to 3.8 million barrels. Now, if it does, and it probably will, and it's going to be dirt cheap oil, what's that going to do to the price? So, and what's the likelihood is that all these other nations such as Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi and all that are going to just go, well, we're just going to adhere to this. Yeah, they are for now, but within no time they'll just go, well, screw this OPEC-led agreement. We'll just start producing because they're going to see Iran's doing it and then get into a flat panic and start increasing themselves. So all in all, the overall assessment, and we've talked quite at length about, but I thought it was important to raise it, is just how much in a precarious state the oil industry is, not just in the US, but globally. And of course, it does all come back to the petrodollar and, the history, as I'll go into a brief little podcast, we'll explain to people why, in a sense, and I use this in guarded terms, it was a genius stroke in the 70s by Kissinger and Nixon. Yeah. But obviously, as we're seeing, rapidly the whole petrodollar is falling apart, and this is why. And when we look at the whole US oil sector and what's going on, it just shows really economically how deeply damaging this is to the US economy.
Oh, it's tremendous, man. I mean, I think the FT, Financial Times, actually put out an article, oil and gas discoveries dry up to the lowest total for 60 years. I mean, there was like 174 discoveries last year worldwide alone. Prior to that, in 2012 to 2013, there's about 500. So there's a tremendous slowdown, especially in the West, because I mean, why would anybody want to drill at such low prices? U.S. shale and U.S. shale oil is just too darn expensive to take out of the ground. It's unbelievable what's happening.
Yeah, and never mind all the environmental concerns, which I think are very valid. and therefore are a major problem. And of course, there is this whole argument about global peak oil, and sometimes you can see arguments for and against it. But the problem is, I mean, if you look at, they know there's a huge amount of oil in the Arctic.
Right.
But the problem is, even Russia has said, we're all going to have to work together to get this out of the ground because it's going to be extremely expensive. Now, I know people are going to say, well, the oil industry is going to disappear eventually and we're going to get all this new technology. Well, yeah, eventually, but when's eventually? And don't imagine it's going to happen next month or next year. It's some way off in the future before that becomes a reality, despite what people may hear to the contrary. So there is a problem with in regards to the what's commercially available in oil. Yeah, there's oil in the ground, but if it costs you $100 a barrel to get it out, does anyone realistically see in a declining global economy where it's clear that the demand for oil is dropping off because there's a glut of oil? I mean, and the Chinese very happily said, well, we'll just buy the glut of oil up, and they kept buying it up until the fact they've got nowhere left to store it anymore. And now they're going, well, has anyone got any tankers that we can put in one of our ports and just keep filling up, because they just want to buy all the oil they can get their hands on, and understandably so. But when you set it against the backdrop of a global economy, the likelihood is oil's not going to stay at $50 a barrel. It's going to go south, maybe 40. I mean, some people have said to me they could see it going down to 30, 25, $20 a barrel. And if we do have a big economic shock, which is very possible, then
Right.
yeah, anything's possible. I mean, yeah, there's always the argument that someone will try and create some massive geopolitical event to spike the price of oil. But even if they manage to pull that off, and I doubt that's likely, it's only going to be short-lived.
Right.
The actual macroeconomics of the oil sector is it's in serious decline, and those figures coming out from the US oil companies proves that categorically.
I agree with you 100%. And my thing is, there's such a glut in oil. There's way too much of it out there. There's the lack of discoveries. The oil companies are all burning red. They're all bleeding out. What possible false flag can they pull to spike oil prices in any sort of a sustainable level that's long term? You can't do it. The mathematics just are not working in their favor, Paul.
No, absolutely. No. I mean, without a shadow of a doubt, it's a complete farcical situation. And so, yeah, I think we've talked a lot about oil, but I think it's quite important, and not to labour on it week in, week out, but occasionally it's worth mentioning the macroeconomics of what's going on.
Absolutely.
But I mean, going on, I think we always have to kind of focus a lot on what Trump's doing now. Obviously, he met with Abe, and there's a lot of debate as to what was discussed. But if we look at Japan, what is for me is kind of interesting, and there's a new tick report due out shortly.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you about Japan. Go ahead.
Now, there's a tick report due out, and obviously I always look at it with interest. It comes out some point this week. Who's selling U.S. Treasuries, particularly by the foreign accounts?
Mm-hmm.
Now, to put this in context, obviously there's been a net sale of treasuries for the last 2 years. You don't hear that much in the mainstream media, but much of the focus has been on China. But we need to look at Japan. Japan sold about 21 billion in December, the largest net sale in around 4 years. Now, to put this in context, it still looks quite healthy because foreign investors hold about 42, 43% of US government debt. However, that's down from 56% in 2008. Which is quite a considerable drop since the economic crisis. Now, corresponding, of course, we know one of the biggest buyers of US Treasuries is the Federal Reserve, which has held pretty flat for the last 2 years, around $2.4 trillion worth. That's more than the combined holdings of Japan and China.
Right.
I mean, that's just to put it in context. Now, of course, the question is who's buying up all the US Treasuries? Well, we've talked about the Exchange Stabilization Fund and the bloated holdings on nations such as the Cayman Islands. Now, interestingly, of course, well, on the backdrop of Japan dumping treasuries, Japan's economy is an utter train wreck.
Oh.
I mean, it's got the largest debt GDP burden of any developed nation in the world. I think they haven't put the figures out for 2016, but it was 230% at the end of 2015. And in terms of purchasing their own debt and equity ETF, they're doing it at a level of $700 billion per year. And the Bank of Japan's the largest owner of equity ETFs.
Yeah, 60% of
the country.
Of their stock market is owned by their own central bank. It is lunacy.
Yeah. I mean, how much more obvious does it have to get that manipulation's going on? Now, So of course, the problem is my question would be to Donald Trump. Okay, so you're having these discussions. I understand, and of course the old thing about North Korea rears its ugly head. Now the reality is North Korea was a cabal vassal state. It was an experiment in isolationism. And periodically, they get word, just go and do some missile test, and then historically, of course, it gave the US an opportunity to flex their muscles in the Far East and raise their military presence there because they just needed an excuse. And Japan was very happy because North Korea is on their doorstep. And lo and behold, what happens? It happens again. Oh, I mean, how convenient. But the reality is, okay, we've heard talk of Japan investing in infrastructure projects in the US. What with exactly? I mean, is this more of the printed money? Yeah, well, almost certainly. And the question from the US perspective is, okay, they've historically had an ally, but of course Japan was another cabal vassal state. But it now seems that that's kind of largely changing because cabal's influence is on the wane. But there's this idea we're going to have this, Japan and the US are going to be firm allies, and already, I don't know whether it's true, but the Chinese Foreign Ministry is going, hang on, we've heard apparently that the US is going to back Japan over the disputed islands in the East China Sea. And of course, China's going, excuse me.
I don't understand what the political motivations or the strategy behind that. Maybe he's trying to bring China to the negotiating table by offending them. That is a negotiating trick that Trump is known for. But Japan is done. Remember,
exactly.
Paul, remember the 80s and 90s? Everybody's talking about Japan Inc. Japan Inc. Like the whole, business is war. Their whole motto. Like, look at where they are now.
Well, the thing is, they had a great time with their white goods industry, and then they built a war chest up and then blew it all. And of course, we laughingly talk about the West and QE to infinity. I mean, they're QE to infinity to the power of infinity. I mean, Japan invented QE to a large extent. They own it. Yeah, they've got the patent on it, and they've probably got the copy. I mean, it's that ridiculous. So to get involved in this thing where, I mean, China's naturally going to say, hang on, it doesn't change the fact, as far as China's concerned, they've owned those islands for since ancient times, and they're not going to shake their resolve. Yeah, they're not going to shake their resolve and determination to protect national sovereignty. So, after the recent, we respect China's, the one China policy, but and seemingly getting China back on track. Now well, we'll find out whether actually, this is because it was Abe who said. Now, I'm not saying Abe's not telling the truth, but again, it's creating a political hot potato for no reason, and the US is in no position to take this kind of attitude with China. And we've said it rather like Russia. And yeah, I understand that this whole historical relationship between the US and Japan, although that's since World War II and for obvious reasons. But from the US's point of view, I'm not really sure, jumping into bed with Japan is going to be particularly beneficial to them, because it's an economic train wreck, and it's going to crash and burn soon enough, simply because of what we just talked about. I mean, $700 billion a year.
Jeez, I mean, their biggest expenditure right now, Paul, for their government is public debt service. It's like 25% of their entire budget. It's crazy.
Well, yeah. And I hadn't bothered to pay a lot of attention to this when we look at foreign reserve holdings. There's all this big thing, and we've talked about before about the capital outflow from China, and China's economy is cratering, and because they sold 650 billion in 2016, and people say China obsesses about its foreign reserves, and the answer is no. The West does to hide its own economic failures. Now, whether you believe, the actual thing, but the US economy is supposed to be, 19 trillion now, and China's supposed to be 11 trillion. I think China's significantly high now. China has reserves of almost $3 trillion.
Correct.
This is 45 times higher than the US. The US has 117 billion US dollars. So, I mean, the 45 times is relative to economic size. And
sure.
And it just shows no one's ever saying, well, how come the US? Now, I know there's the argument the US is the reserve currency, so they can do what they like. And yeah, historically, of course, they just print debt. But no one ever says, well, the US has only got foreign reserves of 117 billion. And China's is 3 trillion. But hang on, China's got major problem. And China's the creditor. The US is the debtor. And we never hear anybody talk about this. And I think it's worth raising this point to highlight to people that this is a more economic reality of what's going on, and yet the fake news mainstream media would have you believe otherwise, that China's in serious trouble. And I'm hearing people still going on. China can easily dump another $1 trillion of foreign reserves, and they won't bat an eyelid. And guess what? In the process, they'll just buy more and more assets up, which is exactly what they've been doing. And they've bought countless US ports. From what I understand, they've bought Detroit and Michigan, and they're going to reindustrialize, parts of America, because it's going to be profitable for them to do so. I know the American people might not like that, but that's the reality, and that's another reason exactly why Trump can't be seen to be meddling in, disputed islands in East China Sea, and because it's just absolutely farcical to do so. But I think, like anything, we heard a lot of rhetoric about Mexico. That's all calming down. The same rhetoric with China, that's calming down. Russia, there isn't any rhetoric. It's all going along seemingly swimmingly, although most of it behind the scenes. And of course, then we have the issue that this week Trump's got Trudeau coming over, which will probably be a bit of I mean, quite what they're going to talk. I mean, possibly, I suppose they're going to talk about NAFTA and go, well, it's a load of rubbish, and what are we going to do about? Well, okay, let's be sensible about this and have some free trade agreements between ourselves. And now, but more importantly, of course, Netanyahu's over on the 15th. Now, interestingly, Israel's been very, very quiet for months. I mean, I've spoken about this for over a year and a half. They've said nothing. Now, as soon as Trump was elected,
Putin has a BB on a leash. That's why.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But interestingly, he started to talk a bit about Iran. And now, the reality is, it's not in the US interest. Yeah, it will support Israel because it has done for ever, basically, since the inception as a nation now. But the problem is, it's in no position to be having these spats with Iran. Iran's far too well supported by Russia and China, as we said. So the issue comes about, and other nations for that matter. So they've attracted huge investment into their country for renewable energies. Yeah, people won't realize this. Iran, massive oil producers looking into renewable energies in a big way, and it's attracted a lot of foreign investment. So another example of how the US may have this intransigent position towards Iran, and it's partly doing it because of it's appeasing Saudi, as we said, and obviously Israel to some extent too, no doubt. But it's in no position to start bullying them as a nation, and it would be absolutely farcical to do so. So we await with interest what comes out in reality, not the words that the mainstream media will report to do with Trump and Netanyahu, but the reality of what comes out, because he's already said to the Israelis, we're not really keen on any more settlements, and now they've reiterated we're not moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. They've come out with that comment again. So, but I think it's probably a very, very interesting and probably a key meeting, probably the most important meeting that Trump has had since he was elected, will be meeting Netanyahu. So we await with interest as to what exactly the outcome of that is.
Yeah, exactly. The funny thing with Trudeau, this guy, he's great at doing photo ops at gay pride parades, but in terms of negotiating trade or anything else, the man is absolutely a wet noodle. I can't wait to see the outcome of that meeting.
Well, yeah, I mean, who knows what? It's very difficult. So, I mean, Trudeau's he's trying to court, favor with numerous nations around the world, and they're still having this intransigent attitude towards Russia. Well, I'll be interesting to see. There's a lot of speculation about the future of Alaska as well, which might be interesting, because there's a school of thought, and I'm just throwing this out there, that in fact Alaska still belongs to Russia.
Yeah, in fact, I think it was one of our contributors, Ken Shorgen Jr., who's an economist and a historian. He wrote about it. He actually, one of his position papers that he wrote about, I think when he spent time in his naval service, was something to do with Alaska. And yeah, there is talk about that. I'm not exactly sure, but go ahead, Paul. You
Well,
want to,
no, exactly. That's what I got told a few years ago, that there was some renegotiation that Alaska may actually go back to Russia at some point. Now, that would be, well, that's going to be a huge political hot potato in itself. But I mean, from Canada's point of view, if they have this very anti-Russian stance, so hang on a minute, they're not across the Bering Straits anymore. They're actually on our doorstep. So I don't know. I mean, Trudeau doesn't. He just strikes me as being one of those career politicians.
yeah, he's an Obama.
You
He's
know,
Obama light.
yeah,
That's what he is.
yeah, and he's not really going to achieve anything of any substance for the Canadian people. But again, it's more to do with less what the mainstream media reports. We have to kind of read between the lines a week or two afterwards to gauge the idea of what actually went on, and then try and find some source of information to corroborate what we understand is going on. That's the big thing. When we talk about things, I won't say, oh, X, Y, and Z's happening unless I've got two or three different independent people who can verify it, because I hear a lot of things.
Yeah.
And sometimes some of it is absolute rubbish.
Right.
And you can tell straight off it's rubbish. And sometimes it's almost believable rubbish. So you have to be extremely careful. And that's something people in general, from the alternative media perspective, need to stop just hearing something and believing it's reality. Go and find out someone to, verify that that's actually the case. And because that's becoming increasingly a big problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't mean there's so many things going on, man. I mean, you got what's the latest going on with I mean, we covered Japan, China. Anything going on with the? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, well, one thing I looked at, the old VIX, was kind of something kind of quite interesting cropped up. Now, just to explain to people, it's obviously a volatility index, and it measures market expectations of near-term volatility in the S&P 500. So clearly, the lower the figure, the less volatile it is. Now, the VIX has closed below 15 for over 50 consecutive sessions. And large speculators are short, apparently, by the largest amount in 12 years. I mean, this is incredulous. The S&P is at record highs, but it's seen to be not really that volatile, as never mind the economic reality that underpins it. Now, but however, interestingly, there's been somebody who has been putting in short-term options that now they're betting on the likelihood that the volatility will jump over 20. Now, obviously, to put this in context as well, the VIX being in this range, 10 to 20, there has been some spikes occasionally for the last 5 years. And the last time we saw a huge spike was the 2011 economic crisis, which was the contagion problem to do with European sovereign debt. Now, funny how that went away, obviously, even though it's many times worse than it is now, as we've discussed. But the price paid for these call options are around 50 cents, and typically for a month. Now, for anyone who doesn't understand, obviously, and there might be some people who don't, a call option is obviously the agreement where an investor has the right to buy a stock or bond or some other instrument at a specified price within a specified time period. Now, the total premium this person's paid is around $34 million. Now, conventional wisdom would suggest it's unlikely that these call options are being used to express an outright view of, that you're going to think the volatility is going to go through the roof. And people say it's a hedge position. I suspect it's the former. Now, and this is pure speculation to anyone listening. I'm not saying this is the case, but it could add that they're anticipating fireworks happening end of January and into March. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but by all accounts, from what I was told, because I went and asked someone, they said this is very unusual and they've never seen the like of this happen before. Now, yeah, it could be a hedged position against, well, who knows what they could be hedging again. But I thought it was extremely interesting to see this happen. And who is this mystery buyer, and why do they anticipate? Because if the VIX goes to 25, they're going to be quits in. If the VIX starts to go to 25, it's indicative for me of some major problem that's then become a tangible reality apart, even though there are already tangible realities, but it becomes something that is so tangible that even the fake news economists can no longer deny the reality of it. So I'm wondering if there's something behind that. So, well, it'll be interesting to see. We're in the middle of February now, so in the next month. But by the way, as I say, I'll stress the point, I'm not saying something's definitely going to happen. It's just you observe these things and see. Well, we'll actually see if this investor keeps putting these call options in.
Yeah, I mean, seriously. I mean, you said that the VIX are at a 20 right now.
Well, actually, I think it's about 13 at the moment.
Yeah,
And
it's
that
so
was after
13. Okay.
it was below 10 a few days ago.
Yeah, it was
I mean,
odd.
I think it had a spike of 20%. I don't know why, but probably because Donald Trump said something. But
Right.
but yeah, I mean, it was ridiculously low, and whoever this investor is has this view that something now it could be a hedge against something. Yes, that's possible. I don't. I suspect it is, and I think they think something's coming down the track. And we've seen in history before when we had the Lehman crisis and everything, there was people
Hmm.
who knew exactly what was going on, and there was some very, very strange trades at the time going through that didn't make any sense. And of course, afterwards, people realized, oh, hang on, they knew exactly what was going on. Now, I'm not saying that's the case, and we might get through February and March, and it was just a hedge in some way. But I think it's an interesting thing to observe at this point in time.
Yeah, definitely agree. That's very, very interesting. I wonder why that is. What else was on your radar, brother?
Actually, there's a couple of bits I kind of missed about the UK economy that I think is worth mentioning, because we know that the Western economy is all geared around the service sector, retail sales. Now, in December, apparently there was this big, huge upsurge of growth in 2.5% in UK retail sales. Now, apparently it's fallen back in January, despite the fact that you know January, mind you, in the UK, there's sales on nearly all year round, but there is particularly larger sales, and of course that didn't materialize in retail sales. But interestingly, face-to-face selling is falling off a cliff edge, while digital commerce continues to grow, and that's going to have a problem for commercial real estate, as we know. But what I
Yeah.
think is interesting is that we're now seeing a decline in real basic household goods and clothing in the UK,
Mm.
and the traditional start of year sales did absolutely nothing, and this was the biggest drop in nearly 5 years. So this is more economic reality biting, and perhaps one of the most interesting indicators that came out, and it came out this morning. Now, apparently the UK's pensioners, people of retirement age, and now got higher household incomes than working families for the first time ever. Now, that is, some people will say, oh, well, that's because pensioners have got personal pensions and they own properties. Well, yeah, that's an element of truth. But the fact we've had this reversal in just over a decade where people who are working are now, and they'll say, oh, it's only £20 a week. Well, yeah, but 10 years ago, they were £70 worse off pension. Now, what does that tell us about the real state of the UK economy? When you have working families whose earnings are so poor. I mean, bear in mind, there's a lot of people of retirement age in the UK who don't have private pensions. They just live off state pension. So what does that really tell us about working families and what their real earnings potential is? It is staggeringly bad.
Yeah.
And again, it's another indication of an economy that's been wrecked by QE and zero interest rate policy. It's what underpins, I mean, it's what destroyed the Japanese economy. And we saw that years before it ever even happened in the West. And it's another example that the UK economy, despite, oh, we've got very low unemployment and all the economic indicators to the contrary, we just see economic reality coming out every day of the week across all the Eurozone nations and the US and beyond. And they're classic examples of major problems when you start to see pensioners having higher household incomes than working families. I mean, what
Yeah.
does that mean of people doing minimum wage jobs? I mean, there was a whole thing in the US where they called it the kind of bartenders and waiters and waitress jobs, where people get paid very poorly. Now, okay, there's minimum wage in the UK, but I think a lot of jobs now are minimum wage based. Well, people can't even afford to live on that. If you
Yeah.
earn minimum wage, you can't pay. I mean, if you couldn't have a mortgage because you don't earn enough money, and you certainly will be struggling to pay because rents are not cheap either in the UK, because correspondingly, as well as the housing market being a ridiculous bubble, also to a large extent, rents have gone through the roof in a disproportionate way as well. So there are more economic indicators of big problems in the UK. Yeah, leaving Brexit, great idea, but the economic reality is it is going to have a severe problems for a number of years, and in terms of rotating its economy, as is the US, as is all Western nations. And meanwhile, China's been doing what China does really well with its 5-year plans, light years ahead, because they knew what was coming.
Yeah.
Hence why they buy gold and silver, and so does Russia and other nations in the East for that reason. Meanwhile, what's the UK and the US doing?
Trash,
Exactly nothing.
recyclables, and pornography. That's our biggest export. What about you guys?
Yeah, probably. Well, pornography is part of GDP now. So
Oh, yeah, it is. It is. I mean, I think it was yeah, I think the BOE said that they need to count prostitution and those things and drug deals and human smuggling as part of the GDP. I think the EU, the European Central Bank said that they needed to do that a few years ago. It's unbelievable. This
yeah,
is what the Western
exactly.
economies have come to, Paul.
Absolutely. Um, no doubt about it. I thought there was something else that came to mind was, and I put a little podcast out on the new YouTube channel about the immigration bill, and when everyone's going to get completely flustered about the legality of it and due process and all that. And for me, the three main points was, the judgment gives the Trump administration guidance as to how they need to redraft another executive order. By all accounts, that's exactly what they're doing. It also means that while we're in this kind of situation where the bill's kind of on hold, it removes the likelihood of false flag terrorist attacks simply on the basis that if there was one, Trump's going to be vindicated. Even his most fierce critics are going to hang on. He said there might be a problem. Oh, hang on, we've had a major problem.
Yeah.
And it would be an extreme own goal for the cabal, the deep state, whoever you want, who want him removed from power, although it's a move that will fail. And I mean, I don't understand US law or US Constitution that well. I know a bit about it. But this ruling can open up a huge can of worms, which can be set as a precedent and used as to challenge previous legislation, which could be damaging to the interests of the deep state or otherwise. Losing a legal case it can have some substantial fringe benefits, particularly for an administration such as the US. And of course, interestingly, and what came out, there was a review apparently of information compiled by a Senate committee in 2016. It said that 72 individuals from the 7 countries covered in Trump's, executive order have been convicted in terror cases since the 9/11 attacks.
Yep. Absolutely correct.
Didn't hear much of that in the mainstream media, and that's in stark contrast to the assertions made by these Ninth Circuit judges who blocked the order, obviously saying there's no evidence showing a risk to the US. And of course, what's interesting is that obviously when they had this Senate subcommittee on immigration, which was actually chaired, interestingly, apparently by Jeff Sessions, who's the new Attorney General. Now, it released this report on these individuals convicted in terror cases. And it had to use open sources because the Obama administration refused to provide government records. I wonder why. Well, we know why. And the report that found that obviously 380 people out of 580 people convicted in these terror cases since 9/11 were foreign born. The report's no longer available on the Senate website. But the fact is, this adds some credence, whether people like it, whether people want to blow it out of proportion and say it was all about attack on Muslims. Well, if it was an attack on Muslims, I would ask one question. The Muslims live in every country on this planet, so why did they only exclude Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen? Yes, there may be largely Muslim people living in those countries, but that's not the point. I don't see any evidence. I mean, there was the report that came out mentioned the word Muslim, I think, 3 times. It didn't suggest that that was what was said. It was saying there were suggestions that that was the case, but there's no actual evidence to support that. Now, of course, people may argue to the contrary, but the fact is there was evidence that they had to use open source evidence because the Obama administration wouldn't provide government records. Now, and these are the 7 countries that his administration came up with. Well, it would suggest they came up on this because they had access to this information and thought this was a potential problem. And of course, the issue comes back to all of this is at some point, whether people like it or not, and yes, there are going to be some people who are very much inconvenienced who shouldn't be, and there are situations where I think if someone's got a green card and has lived in the US for years, it's ridiculous that they leave the country and can't come back and live there.
Yeah.
But from what I understand, that a lot of the basis of this whole immigration bill was because there was a fear of an attack that would happen on US soil. I think, given the deep state cabal, whatever you want to call it, very much don't want Trump as president, that was a very likely scenario. And I think that's precisely why this bill came to pass. Now, I mean, people will argue to the contrary, and that's fine. You can have that viewpoint. But the fact is that there was information essentially suppressed about these individuals named in a Senate report. And it's just, well, why was this hidden? And why did these, Ninth Circuit judges make no reference to this? That's as ever, there's always questions with this, and people need to go out there and get the answers to it. Don't just believe the hysteria on one side or the other. There are questions that need to be answered, and then more people will get to the source of reality and the fact of what's actually going on.
Yeah. At the end of the day, people need to have the brain capacity to say to themselves, what business do judges have with a national security threat? Are judges in the intelligence business? No, they're not. So how can a judge make a call like this? It's ridiculous, Paul.
Well, it is, because I don't see how, let's set aside what the reality of this. They are not going to be privy to information of national security for obvious reasons, much like you, I, or anyone else shouldn't be. Now, if there is sufficient information of national that deem this from a national security perspective, then it's not something absolutely they're going to be aware of. Now, okay, there's evidence about these 72 named individuals, kind of slightly damages their assertions as to why they blocked the order in the first place. But no, absolutely. And what are we going to do? Have a situation? Well, actually, let's put all the information of national security in the public domain because it's in the public interest to know. Well, maybe to some extent, after a disclosure period, yeah, but I don't think anything should be put in the public domain that threatens the national security. Now, though, people will say, and rightly, the cabal have hidden a lot of things over years, and for deliberately and intentionally to distort the public's perspective on things. And yes, that's true. But I think at some point we have to say, well, realistically, you're absolutely right. I don't see how, whatever judge, whether it's the Supreme Court, wherever it is, it doesn't matter. There's going to be a line you have to draw which says, well, certain information cannot be given to them. Yeah, you might be able to say in broad terms, look, we believe there's security risks associated with nations at this current time. Unfortunately, we can't ascertain who those individuals are. Therefore, unfortunately, we suggest putting in this executive order. It is going to inconvenience people. It's not ideal, and absolutely it isn't. And but if that is the reason, then I think it's very hard to argue against it. Now, of course, the problem is that Trump has said some things in the past which have soured people's view, and he probably should have wisely thought about things differently, because he has put himself up to be shot at to some extent by the comments he's made. Now, of course, some of them might have been blown out of proportion and distorted, because I don't know what he said, because I wasn't privy to those meetings. But there is that risk as well, and of course, he needs to be a little bit more careful how he refers to things. I think the whole point is we need to get away from this idea of trying to score points based on people's religion and ethnicity and everything else. We need to start saying we have a global terrorist problem. Yes, and if there's a global terrorist problem that emanates all over the world, and it isn't just these nations, there's terror cells, and I'm not trying to scare people or sensationalize things, but there is a problem. We know that the origins of all this terrorism was cabal based. Of course it is. We know that the CIA founded Al Qaeda and et cetera, but if we have a global terrorist problem, it is the duty of all nations going forward to act responsibly, to deal with those problems, and to eliminate this global terrorist threat, not just what's going on in Syria, which is outright terrorism, or what's going on in Yemen to some extent, because I don't know exactly, or other nations in the world. Iraq's got problems. Afghanistan has problems. We've had terrorist attacks that people will say it's false flag. I don't care whether it's false flag or not. People have died as a result of this, and this needs to be combated internationally. And if that means, if someone says there's a major problem with people coming in, leaving the UK, or leaving the UK and going somewhere else, and they put a blanket ban on everyone in the UK for a legitimate reason, not for an illegitimate reason, then we have to just abide by it and go, okay, well, if it's a temporary ban, and that was the other point, it was a temporary ban, not a permanent one. So then no one asked the question why they're having a temporary ban. Well, I think the problem is there's a realization that the US immigration process and how they handle things is woefully inadequate. It hasn't dealt with problems. And I think this was partly a chance for them to say, we need to shore up our process so people who are legitimately allowed to come into the country can do so. Those there are questions about will be detained and questioned, and those who we absolutely don't want in the country are not coming here. And that's a fair position to have. But unfortunately, while you have this transitional phase, you're going to have issues where people are going to say, well, unfortunately, Paul, you want to go to the US, well, you can't go currently. And I know it's really inconvenient, but in the fullness of time, you'll be able to go again. Then people can't complain. I mean, yes, if this was just some stupid, ridiculous order because there was an issue for no good reason to do with immigration, then you could arguably say, well, this is ridiculous and it's completely disproportionate, and I would support anyone's view on that.
Right.
But
Absolutely.
I don't see any. Again, it's where's the context? Where is the discussion that says, okay, if you're saying you want to put this executive order in place for these 7 nations, can you please, within the boundaries of national security, explain to us why you perceive this as a problem? But that question was never asked. And these are important distinctions to get to the bottom of why things are happening. And you know what? As I've always said all along, if Trump is behaving out of order, then nobody, including me, will support him. If I think he's being ridiculous policy with Iran, I'll say so. I think economic ties with Japan.
I think it's stupid, and I don't understand what the political angle is over there.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one example. I don't really understand why it sees any economic partnerships with Japan, although, time will tell. Maybe, Japan's looking to the future and this is part of the new paradigm, including how you build relations, and they're looking to the future. Well, that's entirely possible as well. But, where criticism is due, we'll level it at people like Trump, and where we feel that, people should give him a bit of latitude, we'll say likewise. And if he introduces some policies that look to be successful, or something that we aspire to and think is a good idea, we'll say so. So I'm not pro Trump. I'm pro redeveloping the entire world, and to make the US a strong nation amongst equals. That has to happen. It's good for the US people, it's good globally, and that's what we need to aspire to. And hopefully Trump will be the guy to do that. But he's going to make mistakes as well. And as long as he holds his hand up to the American people and the world and goes, well, I've made a mistake, I shouldn't have done this, then fair enough. I think that's the new age of real politics, where politicians will accept the fact they've made mistakes. And I think, the electorate or the voters in nations will have far more respect. But at the moment, the problem is they're not used to having a politician who's brutally honest with them. And that brutal honesty at times is going to be questioned, and people will take issue with it. I understand that, but at the end of the day, we just have to see what pans out, and can't judge the guy after 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever. Let's see what he's done in a year, 2 years, and 4 years, and in an ever-changing world. And that's the other thing. The frame of reference of how the world is now is not going to look anything like that in a year's time or 2 years' time. And that we can be absolutely certain of.
Absolutely. Paul, we're at the end of our broadcast, man. Why don't you give out your social media, your website, and how people could follow you and your premium service?
Well, thank you. First off, well, obviously we have the website, the Sirius report. That's obviously SIRIUS. Now, obviously, there's lots of free content on there. I think we've got now over 100 articles in geopolitical, economic, and other spheres. Also, obviously, we have the premium content page, which you can subscribe to it. And thanks very much to Rogue Money, because they've really given us a lot of free publicity, and it's helped with getting us quite a lot more subscribers. But for that, you get 5 podcasts a week, normally 10 to 15 minutes each. We do in-depth analysis of daily events, things that are ongoing. Any intelligence stuff that we can give you and tell you about, we will tell you. That costs $4.75 a month. So you get roughly 22 a month or so. We also have the new YouTube channel, which is London Paul. There's only a few clips on there to start with, but that's really a way of complementing, giving people some idea what the podcast service is about, to some degree anyway. Without obviously, and what we're looking to do going forward is to put a weekly high level in the sense that people get an idea of what we discussed without all the detail, because obviously we don't give all the detail because that's completely unfair to to our premium content subscribers. And we have the Twitter page at the Sirius Report, which we've got quite a lot of new followers, and time, being what it is, we'll try and, utilize that more. And I think, and then obviously there's the Facebook page, the Sirius Report, and then there's the premium content page for Facebook page as well, which is just for premium content subscribers. And I think that's probably just about covered everything off.
Absolutely. And with that being said, folks, I'm V, the Guerrilla Economist, and we are from roguemoney.net. And also, again, subscribe to Paul's podcast. I cannot emphasize, and we don't get a penny out of saying this, it's just awesome work. It is having an intelligence briefing day by day on the pertinent issues of the day that's concerning the world and you. So subscribe to that. With that being said, we'll be back next week with another Sirius Report with none other than London Paul. Thank you, everyone, for listening in. Take it away, CJ.
All right, great show. Excellent.